Good morning, everyone. Stuart from Insync Technology speaking here. Hopefully the audio is coming out nice and clear on your end. We're just about to get started, so we might just give it another 30 seconds for people to get on the stream. But this will be recorded and available later on our YouTube channel as well. Don't forget, there's moderated Q&A, so if you've got any questions, pop them in the Q&A window, and myself or Damien will attend to those and surface them up to our speaker, Loryan, later in the broadcast. All right, we might get cracking. My name's Stuart from Insync Technology. So we're a Microsoft Modern Workplace focused partner in Brisbane, Sydney and Melbourne. So we're all about helping our customers be efficient, be productive and focus on what gets you results. And so our mission is to help organizations unlock the power of a digital workplace. Today, our webinar is on Skype for Business to Microsoft Teams transition. And the ability to do that within a day if you really want to. So we've got our speaker today, Loryan Strant. So Loryan works for us out of our Melbourne office as a Teams product manager. So Loryan is also a Microsoft most valuable professional around Office server and services, and has a wealth of experience around Office 365, Microsoft 365 and Teams. And we've also got Damien and myself sticking around on Q&A, so to answer any more of the technical questions. But with that, I'll hand over to Loryan, and if you have any questions, just pop them in the Q&A, and we'll get around to answering them through the course of the session. Thanks.
Thanks for that introduction, Stuart. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good middle of the night, wherever you may be, because I know there's a fair few international people attending in. As Stuart said, my name is Loryan Strant. I'll be taking you through this journey of Skype to Teams in a day. So as Stuart mentioned, I'm a Microsoft MVP. I've been living and breathing Office 365 since it was back in the BPOS days. And I've written a couple of books. I wouldn't recommend you buy them because they're grossly out of date. But why I care about this is because realistically, organizations have been kind of a little bit slow to move to Teams, or those who have done it have not necessarily done it in the best ways. So what my hope is today is to take you through how you can actually get to Teams faster, as I see a lot of roadblocks when we talk to customers about how to get from Skype to Teams. One thing I would say is the title may seem like clickbait. Is it clickbait? No, you will legitimately be shown today how you can upgrade from Skype to Teams in just one day. So what I'm going to cover off is just a really quick recap of Teams, the challenges that people have with Skype to Teams and why they don't necessarily move across that quickly, some of the common scenarios when moving from Skype to Teams, how to actually do Teams without Teams, which is a little bit confusing in the name, but that'll become clearer later, and what your next steps are from here. So a little bit of faff on why Microsoft Teams. Now, the reality is chances are you already know what Microsoft Teams is, so I won't spend too long on it. But realistically, Microsoft Teams has been available for just over 2 years and really shows no signs of weakening the momentum. I think it was actually a couple of weeks ago that Microsoft did a blog post saying they've got 13 million daily active users inside of Teams. So as Microsoft's fastest growing app, it cemented its place in the world of business, education, healthcare, and pretty much practically every industry on the planet. And it's due in no small part to the fact that Teams is a replacement for Skype for Business. So note there that it is a replacement, not an upgrade. It's an upgrade from, but it's not just a client upgrade like when we went from Link to Skype. So this is where organizations need to pause before proceeding with Microsoft Teams, because as I said, it's not an upgrade, it's a replacement. There's things that will need to be migrated between them. However, some of those are fairly rudimentary, but the reality is that Teams is a completely different platform and one that surfaces the features of Office 365 in a way that wasn't previously possible with the platform. So, one might wonder, why are we using the term upgrade in the title of this webinar? So Skype to Teams Instant Upgrade, or upgrade in a day. And that's because the objective is how to upgrade your way of working, how to upgrade your platform without having to worry about all the complications around teamwork and bots and governance and life cycles, security management, change management, and so on. So while the best of teams can be achieved if you approach it from the perspective of a tool that can shift how people work together. And the reality is that some organizations may not be ready for that. They might want to be getting off Skype for Business server that's on-prem on legacy hardware, or Link, for example. And so, you know, or some might actually have to stay with Skype for Business for one reason or another we might cover off. So, as I said, the reality is that Teams is many things. It's a single pane of glass that can access many of the Office 365 services, as well as new ways of working through the foundation of Teams and channels and those kind of things. Interestingly to note, though, that if you think about it, Teams is effectively what Outlook 97 was about 20 years ago. In fact, Teams was built by a number of the same people who originally developed Outlook 97. So that's why you can kind of see, if you think about it, some similar elements of the interface between Teams and Outlook 97, or what we see today with Outlook. The key difference is that, you know, Outlook 97 brought together a number of separate applications such as Schedule Plus and Microsoft Mail, and Teams kind of does the same. It brings together SharePoint and Skype for Business and a bunch of others. The important thing with Teams to note is that it's about context. So files don't exist on their own. They're in the same place as conversations, applications, and other information. So Teams provides organizations, teams, and individuals with a way to improve how they work. But the reality is that many people actually haven't changed the way they communicate since they first started using Outlook, potentially all the way back in 1997. So as this session is not about changing the way you work and extolling the virtues of Teams, it's about purely getting from Skype for Business away from the legacy platform and onto Teams with a minimum of configuration, cost, and fuss. So let's quickly dive into some of the challenges that we have with implementing Microsoft Teams. So there's really kind of two ways to implement Teams in any organization. There's properly and messy. So the problem is that Microsoft Teams is so new, there isn't exactly a precedence for it that organizations can refer to. There's Microsoft recommendations, there's best practices from MVPs like me who know nothing about your organization, your challenges, your ways of working, and technologies, know nothing about your culture and all those kind of things. So we have a bit of a challenge there. But one thing that we can kind of agree on is, because Microsoft Teams surfaces and interacts with everything inside of Office 365, we need to make sure that your Office 365 health is in a good place. And the challenge with that is that many things have emerged in Office 365 that organizations may have never seen or used before, and maybe turned on, turned off, that organizations haven't even thought of. So some of the things we see here are the usage of apps is unfettered and uncontrolled. People are using whatever they want, how they want. Some people say, well, we've paid for everything, let's give them everything. Great, that can cause its own problems. I respect and appreciate that, but it can become a bit of a problem. We see that legacy items and configuration items still exist from before a time of cloud. So this might be groups and distribution lists and folders, and those kind of things are still sitting there from the O's from before people migrated into the cloud. One of the things I see all too often is that anyone can create an Office 365 group, be it from Outlook, SharePoint, Teams, Power BI, Stream, Planner, and as such, groups spread like a virus. I know of one organization that I worked with recently, has multinational, about 7,500 staff, that when I started dealing with them in April, they had 8.8 thousand groups. By the time we finished the project with them, literally just earlier this month, they had 9.9 thousand groups. That's a bit of a problem, more groups than people. Other things we see are that sharing levels are set incorrectly. They're either too tight and forcing people to use outside tools such as Dropbox, or they're too loose, and so anybody can share anything with anyone anytime. Something I see all too often is that people don't know the existence of audit logs, and so therefore they're not reviewing them, or they're not even enabled in the first place. Another thing that I see often is that adoption usage reports haven't been enabled in Office 365 environments, so people don't even know how people are using Skype for Business or Teams. And often that security has largely been ignored. So there's a lot of features that Office 365 and broadly Microsoft 365 can provide that just haven't been enabled in organizations. So this can cause problems when we're looking to deploy teams, as effectively organizations don't know how their staff are working, what they're using, whether it's been done correctly or not. Organizations think that this is being kind of agile, let people work how they want. But unfortunately, it's kind of deluding themselves because they're just making it someone else's problem. Usually IT, governance, compliance, legal staff, all these people have to deal with the fallout of this down the track. Someone's going to have to clean up those, shy of 10,000 groups for that 7,500 person organization. The challenge is that if you then lock down the systems and dictate terms, all you're simply encouraging is shadow IT, as users will, look for ways to get around those restrictions. So as I said, before just kind of turning on Teams and thrusting it upon users, we have to look at the health of the platform, as ultimately all the platform is going to bubble up through the usage of Teams. Some of the other challenges we have to think about then are supporting workloads. So the three key workloads that that Teams uses is Exchange for storage of conversations, that people have, so chats. It also stores files that people share in chat in their personal drive, effectively their OneDrive for Business, and any channel files that sit inside of a team are stored in SharePoint, so in shared drives. So while Teams doesn't particularly care about Outlook itself, the underlying mailbox is important. If this hasn't been migrated to Exchange Online before Teams is deployed, we start seeing issues occurring. So we'll see, for example, that the calendar button or the meetings button in Teams won't work. So people won't know what meetings they've got on from the Teams client, or they'll have difficulty scheduling Teams meetings because Outlook and Teams just don't know of each other behind the scenes. Another example of this is Planner. So a lot of people think that, oh, great, I've moved to Teams. We can work together. We can start working on projects together. Great, let's spin up a Planner. It won't work because the user can't talk to it because Planner relies on the Exchange mailbox for messaging and storage of some items. So the challenge is if we haven't migrated mailboxes to Exchange Online before deploying Teams, yeah, technically it will work, but there's going to be a lot of gotchas that are going to be ultimately lead to user frustration, also potentially compliance issues because there's no record of those conversations. With OneDrive for Business or personal drives, so if home drives haven't been migrated or people haven't been provisioned with a OneDrive, one of the challenges we face is that the chat functionality inside of Teams uses OneDrive for Business. So if I was to have a chat with Stuart, who introduced me at the start of this session, and share a file with him, if I don't have OneDrive for Business, that file doesn't go anywhere. But if I do have OneDrive for Business and things haven't been properly migrated, ultimately what happens is I will copy a file off the network share, stick it in the chat, and now we have a second copy of that file, which leads me to the last one, which is shared drives. So the thing is, shared drives rely on SharePoint for the document library functionality. Now, it doesn't mean you have to invest heavily in SharePoint being your content management system, your document management system, and those kind of things. But unless content has been migrated over to shared drives, being they, either Teams front-ended or through the SharePoint interface itself, what will happen is you'll just have duplication. It's bound to happen as people migrate over. I've just realized. Sorry, there we go. For some reason, I've got a duplication of slides there. But ultimately what will happen is that content will be duplicated, people will get confused, they'll be working on different versions, people will be downloading things. And something that I haven't even covered here is Windows 10. I have seen a number of organizations that use Windows 7 or Windows 8 or 8.1 and still using Teams, or are on a really early version of Windows 10. So it's actually quite important to have a relatively up-to-date version of Windows 10. It doesn't have to be the latest build, but a key feature that Windows 10 from build 1703, released in 2017, excuse me, what that key feature gives us is something called OneDrive Files on Demand. And this particular feature is important because when I'm working in a team and a channel on some content with Damien and Stuart, that content, as I said, is sitting inside of SharePoint. But if I want to work on that content offline, it's the OneDrive sync engine that actually brings that content to my local machine. But why the updated version is important is because of that OneDrive Files on Demand. So if I've synchronized that library to my local machine, I don't need every single file. I just need the ones that I'm working on. And what OneDrive Files on Demand allows you to do is, as I'm working on those files, it will keep them on my local machine and synchronized. But if I don't have that Files on Demand feature and Richard comes along and dumps a 10 gigabyte recording of a meeting that he had, if I don't have Files on Demand, we are all synchronizing the same content. So Richard dumps that 10 gig into from his computer into that library, and all of a sudden I now have that file, taking up 10 gig on my hard drive. Or if I'm tethered, that's going to be consuming my mobile data, or ultimately just slowing me down from getting my real work done. So hence why we need to have the Windows 10 up to date. So we've got this Files on Demand functionality. So something else we need to look at then is the governance and lifecycle. So I hear this a lot with organizations when they talk about governance. The reality is it means different things to different people. In some cases, it's merely around who can provision a team, and for others, it can who can provision a team and how should the team be configured. So the reality is it needs to encompass the entire gamut of Microsoft Teams functionality, as well as the entire lifespan of its team, including its afterlife. So things that we need to think about are who can create a team? Should any end user be able to do it? Should it be restricted to managers, power users, champions? Should it be channeled through IT admins? Or can the process be automated with an approval workflow? We need to think about who can be the owner of a team. So like Uncle Ben from Spider-Man says, with great power comes great responsibilities. So can anyone be an owner of a team? Should they be an owner of a team? So should the ownership be restricted to those who know the ins and outs of Teams configuration settings? Because if you don't know what you're doing in Teams, maybe you shouldn't be behind the wheel of a team. Should people go through some form of training certification before they're allowed to be an owner? So they actually, can demonstrate that they understand what they're getting, because you get a group, you get a SharePoint site, you get a mailbox, you get a whole bunch of stuff. Other things we need to think about are how long should a team exist for? So should there be some kind of expiry policy to ensure that stale teams don't hang around forever? Should all teams be treated equally, or should some teams have an expiration policy and be perpetual? Also, what's a reasonable expiry policy timeframe? Is it 30 days? Is it 90 days? Is it 180 days or 365 days? Then we have to think about how should teams be named? Should there be some sort of uniformity across team names? Do we need to create a team naming convention for internal teams, project teams, external teams? And how do we control it? Is it through the naming policy built in to the tool, or is it through a provisioning tool? And what happens if a team changes its name? So say, for example, human resources becomes people and culture. How do we handle that? Are all teams the same? So if we decide to create a template for teams, do we apply the same template to all teams when they're created, or do we have different templates for different purposes? So some that have bots pre-configured, some that have OneNote instead of the wiki. And then who's also responsible for choosing individual team settings, such as the Giphy rating, whether we have a moderate, strict, or unrestricted, whether people can delete messages, who can create channels. So, is a project team with guests treated the same way as an internal team? So we have to think about these kind of things as well. What happens to the team when it's deleted? So we've got challenges then around, do we need to keep the files that were created inside of that team? If so, where do they go? What about the conversations? So do we need to preserve the history and the decisions that were made inside of those conversations? What about the plans from Planner? Inside of those will be links to things, will be potentially comments, will be a history of what was done when. So do we need to preserve that, and how do we preserve it? And then what about other content that's in the associated SharePoint site? Because maybe somebody actually went into SharePoint and started using it for news items and lists and other things. And then whose job is it to remove the guests from the organizational directory, from the Azure Active Directory? Then we also have to think about, before we look at all this fancy teamwork stuff, is the culture of the organization. So we have to think about, okay, if you've already used Skype, did you just adopt Skype, really well, or did you just deploy it and thrust it out to people? So as in, are they doing it, are they using it really well in terms of meetings and conversations and presence and tag for status change, or is it just used for phone calls? Is it actually a game changer? We have to think, outside of technology, how are you improving teamwork and collaboration as an organization? Because Teams is not the silver bullet. It's not the fix. It's just a product or a tool that people can use. What are people doing around remote work and life-work balance? Teams enables me to have this call from my home in Melbourne. Damien's in the office in Melbourne, and Stuart's up in Brisbane. So, the tool allows us to do this, but do we have the right culture and the right support mechanisms behind people who may never come into the office or work different hours of the day and those kind of things? So that level needs to be thought about, not just the tool. Do employees feel empowered to innovate and stand up and do things outside of the norm, or is it a very rigid lockdown organization? Potentially some government organizations are very locked down, or healthcare, or those kind of things. So we have to be mindful about how Teams is configured to match that organizational culture. Another thing that's a big challenge is, do management support those new ways of working that Teams heralds, but also ultimately, transformation and those kind of things. We see executives talking about, oh, we've got these great tools, we support these initiatives, but often middle managers just still want to see bums on seats. They still want to see people coming into the office. So, is the organization, are the middle managers, fully on board with this, or are they still just kind of towing the line and doing things the same way when everybody above and below them is trying to change? And the reality is, as well, is when it comes to organizational change and culture, is this actually real, or are you potentially just throwing agile at it and tools and saying it's future ways of working? We've given you Teams, we've given you a fancy office layout, and we've said everybody's agile now, so bang, digital transformation done. So these are just some of the elements that we have to think about before we just go and thrust Teams at people and think about how this can potentially change the way they work. So let's look at some of the common Skype for Business scenarios that we see in organizations that you may be experiencing yourself, and how we look at those, getting from those to Teams. So the first one, the simplest one, is instant messaging and presence. So in this scenario, Skype for Business has been deployed as part of an Office 365 implementation project or program. In some instances, it may have actually been utilized previously as an on-premises server environment, such as, for example, Skype for Business Server or Link Server before that. With this scenario, what we generally see is that some people conduct meetings via Skype for Business, and the organization may have actually implemented dial-in conferencing, either via on-premises infrastructure or directly from Office 365. One of the challenges that we often see with this is that there hasn't necessarily been a real investment in headsets, webcams, or room hardware. So all too often, I see users relying on the earbuds that come with their mobile phones to actually make phone calls and participate in meetings in Skype for Business. Or they're using the webcams built into their laptops, if at all. Room hardware is potentially a camera, maybe a speakerphone, potentially a dedicated PC, or as we also see all too often, an out-of-date conference system that cost a small fortune back in its day, but now really just kind of gathers dust. And one thing that also we often see with this kind of just instant messaging and presence is that there hasn't really been any change management In many instances, Skype for Business is simply thrust upon end users with maybe an email introduction saying, hey, here's this great tool we're turning on today. Maybe a quick reference card as to how to do it, how to make calls, and maybe a link to some online videos and further help guides. So, maybe there's been some basic training, but the reality is that in these situations, Skype for Business is often seen as a nice to have, not really mission critical, and certainly not seen as a key tool improving the way that people communicate. So with all the things that I said before, going from this instant messaging and presence to Teams is a really big change. So if we look at the next category or the next scenario, so instant messaging and presence plus voice. So largely this is going to be the same as the previous scenario, but it's also the phone system. Excuse me. What we might see in this scenario is that usage might be higher than in the just the instant messaging and presence, but only because it's required. Obviously, because it's the phone system, there has been some investment in headsets and also sometimes in room hardware. But again, that may have been done some time ago and it's very expensive stuff that potentially doesn't work or people find too frustrating. And often with these scenarios where, because it is the phone system, people have to know how to use it because we don't tolerate issues with voice. So training would have been provided at rollout. So people would have been shown how to send instant messages. They would have been shown how to make a call, how to transfer a call, how to check your voicemail, and some basic things around that. But one of the things we see is that in this scenario, because Skype for Business is the phone system, I'm not saying everybody's like this, but we do see it quite a lot, that people use it as the phone system, but they actually don't really use the instant messaging and presence capabilities, or even the the meeting capabilities. So they're effectively just using it as dial tone, which is a little bit of a waste of a feature set. So if we look then at more of a traditional type phone system where, yeah, it's still on premises, there's voice involved, but we've also got contact center solutions or call recording or third-party tools built in there, is another Skype for Business scenario that we would have seen why infrastructure has stayed on site, on premises, sorry. Or we've got challenges around internet connectivity. So not everybody can go straight to cloud. There may be Skype for Business gateway servers on premises so that calls can still come in and go out and people aren't relying on the cloud in case there's outages or bandwidth degradation. And another scenario I see quite often is that budget conscious, in that you're trying to sweat the assets. Not saying that people are cheap, it's more so saying that you've only just deployed Skype for Business and you're looking at it saying, what? I've only just done this and now I need to change. So realistically, you'd be wanting to get the most out of what you've already done, regardless whether it's full voice integration in Skype for Business Online or headsets or change management. Ultimately, you've just spent this time, so you kind of want to stay on it as long as possible. So moving along, how do we get this? How do we use Teams, for example, without Teams? So I've talked about wanting to use it for simple scenarios. We're getting to the how to do it in the upgrade in a day. So there's a number of upgrade modes that Skype for Business has when going from Skype to Teams. So I won't go through all of them in detail, but initially we basically had Skype for Business only and Islands mode. And Islands mode is where you effectively run the two in parallel. And while it's useful in some instances, it's also quite dangerous in another. Ultimately, you want to be in kind of one state or another, or a hybrid state, but not both at the same time. So I effectively have got three approaches to getting people to Skype to Teams and using it really quickly without too much cost, training, and fuss, as I mentioned before. So the first one is where you've got Skype for Business, voice and others, is a approach called meetings first, which I'll elaborate shortly in a second. The second one is where you've got instant messaging and presence, but you want to try the teamwork functionality. You're not ready to turn it on for everybody, you want to try it. So I have the what's called see but don't touch approach. And the last one is, look, we just want instant messaging and presence. So like a certain character that I probably can't mention for political correctness sake from Seinfeld, no Teams for you. We'll come back to how they actually use Teams without Teams. So what we have with meetings first is that this is effectively Teams, the client software, is being used for meetings. It also means that the online meeting service functionality is used, and that Skype for Business is used for everything else. So instant messaging, calling, video calling, application sharing, everything, that's still all done by the Skype for Business client. What this allows us to do is that if people are having a meeting, they can use a Teams meeting experience, which is, in all honesty, better than the Skype for Business experience, in that it's got better detection of poor network performance. It has cloud recording. And so there's a lot of other features in terms of what it can do from a meetings perspective that people can have. One of the recent additions that that Teams can do is it can detect that you are in a meeting room with other people with the Teams meeting that's on voice, and you can join it from your device in content mode only. So something that Skype for Business doesn't really do. The next mode that I mentioned along is the see but don't touch. So this is when you set your tenant to be in Teams only mode, and you're effectively using the Teams client for everything, but you just don't want people to have that teamwork functionality. You're not ready for the group side of things. So you're not ready for SharePoint, you're not ready to migrate files or any of those things that I mentioned before that pose as challenges to the full usage of Teams. You just want it for effectively chat, but as I said, this is the scenario where maybe you want a little bit of Teams for some people. So in this instance, the simple solution is just don't make people members of any Office 365 groups. What that will do is that they can see the groups that are listed there, but they can't see them as teams because they're not teams. They can't create any teams because I hope, turned off the ability for end users to create teams without any groups without any control. But what it does allow you to do is to still join teams that you might set up. So maybe you set up an organization-wide team because you're dipping your toe in the water and you want to see what it looks like, or you decided to do that instead of Yammer. So it allows you, as I said, you can see that Teams is there, but you're not really seeing them unless you're a part of it. So the other approach that I call No Teams for You is a little bit contentious, because what it does is effectively you create an app policy where you delete the Teams app from Teams. What it effectively does is renders the Teams client as nothing more than a Skype for Business-like shell, in that all you can do is have chats, calls, video, and meetings. What this also allows you to do is that people can still be a member then of an Office 365 group, but they just won't see the option to add it as a team. Now, while you can see in that screenshot that there is no Teams button, the reality is it's actually hidden under the ellipsis. So if you press the 3 dots underneath files, you can then see the Teams button, but it's effectively out of sight, out of mind. So it's a really good way to get people into it without all those complications that I mentioned before. So ultimately, the result that we end up with is Skype for Business has, for want of a better term, been upgraded to Microsoft Teams because we've been able to do that nice and quickly. We haven't had to really worry about warnings of end of life or anything else to do with Skype for Business. And unless you went with meetings first, you're actually not using Skype for Business at all anymore. You can effectively remove the license from people's Office 365 accounts. You can also uninstall the client from their machine because if they still join a Skype for Business meeting that somebody external to the organization organizes, they can use the Skype app for that, or there's a Skype meetings app that will launch from the web. Ultimately, the functionality is kind of like for like with Skype for Business, just better, because the persistent chat is better than the loose instant messages. The integration of files inside of the chat is better than what we see in Skype for Business, where you send an attachment to somebody else. We've also got in chat, we've got things like the ability to see the organization and to add tabs and those kind of things. So the experience is already better. As I mentioned before, the meetings experience is better, and ultimately the calls experience is better. But basically, same, but much better. What we're also seeing then is staff are on that next generation communication platform and ready for the next step. So if you're not ready to do all this teamwork stuff, because you do have, you are actually working on agile and new office fit outs with room hardware and headsets and change management, or there's other things that are happening that are a bigger priority. So you're not ready for all that stuff. What you've at least done is gotten people onto the Skype for Business, sorry, the Teams platform, and they're ready for when you're ready to do the teamwork. They're just not necessarily using it right now. And while there is a change to the user experience, it's not a massive change. Yes, we're going from instant messages that kind of pop up and flash in your toolbar and then will disappear to being, it pops up, in the Teams button and doesn't flash as much. We're still seeing presence in Outlook and other applications. We're still seeing so people's free busy, we can still call people and hover over and get contact cards. With the buttons still look the same, they're just in different places. And as I said, we've just got now more options and features and things like background blur. So those people who worked from home but never turned their video on because it showed the lounge room or the laundry behind them, well, now they can turn video on, and they can, we don't care what's behind them anymore. So how are the next steps? How do we make this work? So the quick and nasty changeover. So this is the how to literally do it in a day if you kind of almost don't really care for the sanity of your end users. So send them a warning email saying, hey, we're going from Skype for Business to Teams. Set the tenant to Teams only mode. What that will effectively do is migrate their contact lists in the back end. You'll migrate their contact lists from Skype for Business to Teams. So internal and external contacts and any groupings they might have. It will also migrate any meetings at the same time. So convert any meetings that they had that were Skype for Business meetings to Teams meetings. And effectively on the next login, everyone will be forced to use Teams. So yes, it will be done on the day, but until the client signs in the next time, that's when it will actually say, hey, your organization has gone to Teams, click here to join. And you won't actually be able to use the Skype for Business client from that point. So in reality, what's happened is congratulations, you're done. You have done it in a day. As I said, you can do it. If your organization's ready for it, if you don't care about user sanity, blowback, those kind of things, you could just get it done. But it's not necessarily an ideal user experience, and people may not particularly be happy with IT and how you've done it. And it'll just be another thing that's thrust upon them. Realistically, how I tend to see it is, yes, you can do it in a day, but maybe let's stretch it out a little bit longer, maybe a week, maybe a couple of weeks, depending what you're doing. So some bits you can certainly start doing in that first day. So setting some people to Teams only mode in the coexistence mode. So those people can be in Teams only and they can be still communicating with others who are in still Skype for Business. So effectively what we're doing is we're going from Skype for Business to chat. So chat first. And then we can simply start adding on voice and meetings. So you can start dabbling it with PSTN conferencing into Teams. We can start adding in the ability to make phone calls from Teams, be it through hosted call offering like TCO 365 in Australia or direct routing. And then you can start dabbling with things like organization-wide teams. This is a really good place to start if your organization is not ready for the full teamwork stuff behind the scenes. What this allows you to do is to create a Yammer-esque experience where everybody's a member of the same team. And that's where you can have your channels for, CEO updates, social club, other things like that. And it's a good way for people to start understanding how to use Microsoft Teams without it being thrust upon their day-to-day. And then you can start piloting Teams because then again, you've got the client software, you've got everybody used to how to use the actual application. Now you can start saying, right, we're going to turn on the events team and you 6 people are going to start using Microsoft Teams. We're going to pick up your files and move them across. And then from there, we can start moving into full deployment. In a instant messaging and presence and voice scenario, again, we can do this, as I said, quite quickly in a day and just basically bring the voice over to Teams. As I said, it's a quick and nasty. It will work, but there'll just be challenges and you'll probably be creating a lot of work for people to do. but basically follows the same thing, which is get the chat, voice the meetings in there as quickly as possible, and then start, turning on more functionality. The ideal side of things is to do what we call a health check with a bit of a changeover and something called a Teams incubator. So effectively what the health check is doing is looking at your Office 365 environment. So something I mentioned right at the start, which is looking at, hey, is your environment in a good position? Do you have groups creation, open or unrestricted? Do you have your sharing levels set correctly? Those kind of things. Can you add guests or not add guests? What we can then do is set the appropriate coexistence mode. So maybe not everybody on day one is going to be in Teams only mode. Maybe it's going to be a particular location because you've got the bandwidth to do floor walking. Or maybe you're going to set the entire organization to be in meetings first, but some people will be in Teams only. So we've got that that flexibility that we can make there. We can cut over as many users as possible because we've got hopefully some change management strategies and some training planned for them. So not just a case of your button was here, now it's over here. It's more of a case of, hey, this is the difference between a chat versus an instant message. And ultimately, you start understanding where teamwork and functionality lives. So that's what we do as part of that incubator, is actually start looking at what works and what doesn't work, because the reality is that Teams doesn't work in every scenario. Yes, we can look at the slideware and Microsoft will say things like, yes, it works in project management teams. And it does, but in some instances it doesn't. So these things, we have to look at where it doesn't work and then factor that and then start moving on, to the rollout once we've learned, as I said, what works and what doesn't work. A great way to start this is if you are a Microsoft managed customer, they have something called a Microsoft 365 Teamwork Assessment, which is funded by Microsoft and will actually look at how Teams can be used in your organization and can cover some of those kind of things. But ultimately helps get you at least unblocking any of those barriers and looking at, maybe you should do an upgrade in a day, or maybe you should do it in 3 days because you've got several thousand people and it's a little bit of a nasty approach. But ultimately what that teamwork assessment allows you to do is to look at, not just from a technical perspective, what needs to happen, but also from a business perspective, where teams can fit into it. So I'm hoping that what I've shown you today is really how you can actually upgrade to Teams quickly, why you would want to slow down some aspects of it, and how Teams is not necessarily all the bells and whistles in one go. There's the chat functionality of it, and there's also the the teamwork functionality of it. So with that, we'll hand over to any questions coming in, or there's my email address if you have any questions afterwards or want to get in contact.
Thanks, Loryan. So hopefully we've demonstrated that there can be a tailored approach to a Teams migration. So you can do it quickly, you can take a bit longer, but you can also get that Skype for Business-like feel without having to necessarily address teamwork out of the gate. So we think some of these strategies are a popular move for customers to get to the modern collaboration things, but not necessarily hit the users in the face with teamwork concepts and collaboration and Office 365 groups. There's a lot of activity coming in on the question and answer, so feel free to drop your questions in there, whether they're for Loryan or Damien or myself. Nothing's sort of off limits, and if we have to take that offline, then we can do that as well. We'll leave the questions and answers open for the next sort of 5 to 10 minutes. So if you want to drop something in there, feel free to, and we'll do our best to answer it. We'll wait another 1 or 2 minutes for some extra questions to come in, and then we might bring the stream to a close. But you've got Loryan's details and my details at Insync. A lot of you would be existing Insync customers. If there's anything we can help you with regards to Teams, from governance and compliance frameworks through to Microsoft 365 roadmaps, feel free to reach out.
I'm going to read.